On a peaceful Sunday night, June 9th, 1912, the town of Villisca, Iowa, settled into a quiet, typical of the American Midwest. At the white frame house of Josiah and Sarah Moore, laughter faded as their 4 children and 2 young guests, all tired from a church children's program, fell asleep. Sometime between midnight and dawn, a presence moved through the darkened home. Using the family's own axe, this intruder bludgeoned all 8 souls as they slept in a frenzy of violence so controlled that neighbors heard nothing amiss. The killer then performed a series of bizarre, ritualistic acts, covering every mirror in the house, washing up, and laying a slab of bacon beside the bloody weapon, before locking the door and vanishing into the early morning. When the horror was discovered, it would shatter the illusion of safety in small-town America. Who could have committed such an act, and what sinister motive lay behind the meticulous, bloody silence of the Villisca Axe Murders? The America of 1912 was a nation of profound contrasts, perched on the edge of a modern world. It was the twilight of the Progressive Era, a time of growing cities, industrial might, and a burgeoning middle class. Yet in places like Villisca, with a population just over 2,500, life was still dictated by the rhythms of agriculture, church socials, and the reliable schedule of the Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad. It was an era where doors were often left unlocked, trusting in the close-knit fabric of community. This inherent trust, however, existed alongside severe limitations in law enforcement. Forensic science was primitive. Fingerprinting was a novel concept, not yet standard in rural jurisdictions, and blood typing could not yet individualize a suspect. Telephones were rare, and communication between law enforcement agencies was slow and fragmented. A murderer could strike and be states away before a systematic manhunt began. The concept of preserving a crime scene was poorly understood, and the idea of a psychopathic serial killer, driven by compulsions beyond robbery or revenge, was not in the public or professional vocabulary. The events in Villisca would brutally expose the vulnerability of this world, a vulnerability masked by its seeming tranquility. The victims were the very portrait of turn-of-the-century aspiration and community spirit. Josiah B. Moore, 43, was a successful and well-liked businessman. Having once worked for local magnate and state senator Frank F. Jones, Josiah had struck out on his own, operating a successful hardware and implement store that had, notably, taken the prized John Deere dealership from his former employer. His wife, Sarah Montgomery Moore, 39, was a pillar of the Presbyterian Church, having organized the Children's Day program the family attended that final evening. Their 4 children, Herman, 11, Mary Catherine, 10, Arthur, 7, and Paul, 5, were described as bright and lively. On that Sunday, Mary Catherine had invited 2 friends, Lena, 11, and Ina, 8, Stillinger, to spend the night after the church event. The program ended at 9:30 p.m., and the 2 Moore parents, 6 children in tow, walked the short distance home, arriving by 10 o'clock. They performed their nightly routines in the compact 2-story house. There was no indication of fear or premonition. Their last known acts were those of normalcy: putting children to bed, locking up, and retiring for the night, unaware that an observer may have already been hiding in their attic or watching from the barn outside. The event was a massacre of silent, brutal efficiency. Sometime after the household fell asleep, the killer began. The murder weapon was Josiah Moore's own axe, taken from the barn or woodshed. The attack started in the parents' first-floor bedroom. Josiah suffered the most extreme violence, his face and head so brutally struck that his eyes were destroyed. A gouge in the ceiling above the bed testified to the killer's ferocious overhead swings. Sarah was similarly attacked. The killer then moved upstairs to the children's room, bludgeoning Herman, Mary Catherine, Arthur, and Paul as they slept. Evidence suggests the murderer then returned to the master bedroom to inflict more blows before finally descending to the guest room of the parlor where the Stillinger sisters slept. Here, the only sign of awakening occurred. Lena Stillinger likely stirred as she was found with a defensive wound on her arm and her body positioned differently from the others, though later investigations found no evidence of the sexual assault initially suspected. With all 8 victims dead, the killer began a strange, cold ritual. He covered every mirror and reflective surface in the house with clothing or cloth. He went to the kitchen, where investigators would later find a basin of bloody water and untouched food on the table. He opened the icebox, removed a 4-pound slab of bacon, and carried it to the guest room, placing it deliberately beside the axe. He then likely washed, locked the front door from the inside, and exited through a back window or door, disappearing into the pre-dawn darkness of June 10th. The discovery unfolded with a slow, dawning dread that quickly spiraled into chaos. At 7 a.m., neighbor Mary Peckham grew concerned. The Moore family was typically up early tending to chores, but the house was silent, the blinds drawn. After receiving no answer to her knocks, she fetched Josiah's brother, Ross Moore, who had a key. Ross entered, calling out. He opened the door to the first-floor parlor bedroom and discovered the bodies of the Stillinger girls. He immediately retreated and sent Mary Peckham to call the town marshal, Henry Horton. Horton's search confirmed the full, horrific scope of the crime. By 8:40 a.m., the town's telephone exchange issued an all-call, alerting every household with a phone. What happened next was a catastrophic failure of crime scene preservation. Hundreds of townspeople, gripped by morbid curiosity and horror, rushed to the Moore house. They flooded through the rooms, gazing at the bodies, handling the murder weapon, and, tragically, even pocketing fragments of Josiah Moore's skull as macabre souvenirs. The scene was utterly contaminated. It was not until County Coroner Dr. Lindquist arrived and demanded action that Sheriff Orrin Jackson called in the National Guard to establish a perimeter, hours after the discovery. The investigation was crippled before it had properly begun. The initial investigation was hampered by both the era's technological limits and the self-inflicted wound of the contaminated scene. Coroner Lindquist held an inquest on June 11th, interviewing witnesses. Doctors placed the time of death between midnight and 5 a.m. Clues were scant and puzzling. 2 spent cigarette butts were found in the attic, suggesting the killer had hidden there, waiting for the family to return and fall asleep. An imprint in the hayloft of the barn, positioned by a knothole overlooking the house, indicated a period of surveillance. A gas lamp with its chimney removed, turned low to provide a faint glow, was found upstairs. A lone keychain fragment, not belonging to the family, was discovered. Without fingerprints or viable blood evidence, detectives focused on motive. Nothing of value was stolen, ruling out robbery. This led authorities down paths of personal vendetta or madness. Early rumors speculated about a sedative in the family's evening milk or cocoa, but toxicology tests were not conducted. The bizarre post-crime behavior, the covered mirrors, the bacon slab, defied easy explanation and pointed toward a mind divorced from conventional motives. Public and media reaction was a tidal wave of fear, grief, and sensational speculation. The story made national headlines, shattering the myth of the safe rural heartland. The Villisca Review and newspapers across Iowa decried the atrocity. The town itself was paralyzed by terror. Families slept with axes and guns by their beds. Suspicion fell on every stranger and any local with a perceived oddity. The community's trauma was compounded by the knowledge that the killer might still be among them, or that the incompetent handling of the scene might have forever buried the truth. As weeks turned to months with no arrest, the fear curdled into a permanent undercurrent of anxiety and mutual suspicion. The case became a national fascination, a symbol of inexplicable evil, with newspaper editorials debating the breakdown of societal safety and the limits of rural justice. The physical evidence, what little survived the town's intrusion, presented contradictions that have fueled debate for over a century. The sheer number of victims killed in a small house with minimal noise suggested a preternatural calm and strength, or perhaps the use of a blunt instrument that was quieter than a gunshot. The different use of the axe, the blade on Sarah, the blunt side on others, hinted at a symbolic distinction made by the killer. The covered mirrors have been theorized as a superstitious act to prevent the victim's spirits from seeing their killer, or to avoid seeing his own reflection. The bacon slab remains the most inexplicable detail, a grotesque offering, a missed meal, or a deranged signature. The keychain fragment and cigarettes offered potential clues to the killer's identity, but led nowhere. The most critical evidence, the axe handle, had been handled by scores of people, obliterating any hope of fingerprints. The case became a paradox, a crime of intense personal violence with ritualistic elements, yet seemingly without a personal connection to the victims that investigators could trace. Over the decades, several compelling suspects emerged, each leaving a trail of compelling circumstantial evidence that ultimately dead-ended. The first was Reverend George Kelly, an itinerant minister with a history of mental instability and inappropriate behavior toward girls. He was in Villisca for the Children's Day service, left town on a very early train the morning of June 10th, and later developed an obsessive fascination with the case, writing detailed confessional letters to authorities. He was tried twice, but juries found his confessions unreliable, likely coerced, and he was acquitted. The second prominent suspect was Frank F. Jones, the powerful former employer of Josiah Moore. Motive was clear: business rivalry and a rumored affair between Josiah and Jones's daughter-in-law. Theory held that Jones hired a killer, with the most likely candidate being William Blackie Mansfield, a violent ex-con with alleged ties to Jones. Mansfield was investigated for similar axe murders elsewhere, but never charged in Villisca. In later years, authors have posited the terrifying theory of a traveling serial killer, connecting Villisca to a string of similar family axe murders along railroad lines across the country. Each theory fits pieces of the puzzle, but a definitive link remains elusive, buried by time, lost evidence, and the initial calamity at the crime scene. The long silence over Villisca has never been absolute. While no arrest ever came, the case never faded from memory. It festered as Iowa's darkest legend. The house stood for decades, a haunted monument avoided by locals. In the 1990s, historians Darwin and Martha Lynn purchased and meticulously restored it to its 1912 condition, opening it as a museum dedicated to the historical facts of the case. It now attracts thousands of visitors, from true crime historians to paranormal investigators drawn by reports of supernatural activity. For the families of the victims, particularly the Stillingers and Moore relatives, there was no closure. Occasional reinvestigations by journalists, authors, and law enforcement have re-examined the evidence, applying modern profiling techniques. Yet each new theory ultimately circles back to the same irreducible set of cryptic clues and the irreversible loss of forensic opportunity in those first critical hours. The Villisca Axe Murders endure as one of America's most haunting and foundational true crime mysteries. The case remains unsolved not for a lack of suspects, but for a fatal confluence of factors. The profound limitations of 1912 forensic science, the catastrophic destruction of the crime scene by a horrified public, and the chilling possibility that the killer was a transient phantom who vanished onto the rails as suddenly as he appeared. The specific unanswered questions are as potent today as they were then. What did the covered mirrors mean? Why the slab of bacon? Was this a personal, hate-fueled strike commissioned from the shadows of small-town jealousy, or was it the work of an unknown, nomadic predator whose violence visited multiple communities? The house in Villisca stands as a stark, physical reminder. It is a time capsule of both Middle American domesticity and unimaginable violence, a testament to 8 lives brutally erased and a community's innocence forever lost. The truth is locked within the silent details of that night. The positioned bodies, the hidden mirrors, the placidly waiting axe. A century-old cipher waiting for a key that may never be found.